Welcome to SDA Mastery, the podcast series hosted by Tania Gomez Consulting. In each episode, we'll be sharing valuable insights and tips that can help you learn the intricacies of specialist disability accommodation. We will demystify the entire SDA process, give you direct access to experts in the field, and help you to discover what life is like as an SDA provider. Whether you're thinking about leaping into SDA or you're looking to level up your existing NDIS business, you're in the right place. Come on in, let's explore the SDA space together.
Hi Karen, and welcome to SDA Mastery, and today we're having a chat about your specific model of SDA premises, which is really around a apartment model within SDA. To start with, I might get you to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about MyLife Housing, and then tell us a little bit more about your apartments.
Great. Thank you for having me. So MyLife Housing is an SDA provider, and so as the name suggests, SDA is Specialist Disability Accommodation, and so we provide accommodation mainly in the form of new apartments and villas, and at the moment we're pretty much centred around sort of Southwest Sydney, Illawarra and the Central West regions. So I founded the company in 2020 after returning from overseas, after having been away for 12 years. And I came back and decided I wanted to do something that would make a difference to people's lives. And so actually early on, when I first started to think about SDA, I came across a property developer who was quite an early adopter of the scheme back in 2020. And he was looking for someone to collaborate with and to work with a provider that could actually bring his vision of, beautiful, accessible apartments to life. And so that's what sort of drove the decision to start working in the industry. And so we provide accommodation and work in an apartment model like what you've just said.
And your model's quite innovative. There's not a lot of people that do SDA apartments. Can you walk me through what that model is and the inspiration behind your approach?
Yeah. So our focus to date has been on apartments. We really liked the concept of having NDIS apartments sort of dotted throughout a mainstream building. And so they're scattered, and I think it promotes a lot of, this sense of community and sort of independence for residents that are looking for that. So typically in the apartment model, the NDIS apartments are all sort of wired back to this one apartment in the building as well, which we call the concierge apartment or the overnight carers apartment, and they provide really the 24/7 unplanned support for the residents that are living in the building. And so, we spoke about this in the previous podcast, but having a SIL provider take care of that apartment is a really crucial relationship that we engage in, because it needs to be a SIL provider that's willing to work with other sort of planned support providers that actually come in with the residents. And so you're in a situation where you've got multiple providers giving support to the one resident in the building. So there's kind of a lot of stakeholders in the mix. And, for a lot of SIL providers that take on that concierge apartment, it is financially difficult to make the model stack if you're not good at what you do, and if you're not, getting the one-to-one service as well. So far we've managed to do it really successfully. We also, I've been quite fortunate to work with developers from the design stage who actually think of NDIS units in the context of the entire development, and they don't think about accessibility as being something that the resident needs from the front door onwards, right? So they think about it holistically. So, with that mindset, we end up having these really well thought through properties that give residents accessibility and, communal areas that they can use to entertain family and friends. And, we've got in one of our buildings, we've got a dog playground. We have, a large dining and kitchen that they can book out for guests. And so it really is, these things that are put in place at the design stage, 3 years out, that actually prove to be quite successful when the residents move in. And so that model of apartments that we've kind of worked in and we know works, so we're trying to replicate that in a villa context. And so we're about to launch our Bathurst project, where we kind of take that approach of having a community or sort of a communal area where residents can interact if they choose to, but also be able to give them their own private villas where they can retreat to and still be able to get support on site. So we're really excited about that. Yeah.
And why do you think that model works better than some of the other models out there?
I'm not sure that it's better. I think it's more that different dwellings have appeal to different types of participants or their different lifestyles or even their budgets. So I think we found that apartment living really caters for those that want to be independent, want to have a bit of privacy and want to have the freedom to live alone and not have somebody there in their space. And so we find that apartment model works more for a resident that can or is able to use the assistive technology to operate their lights, their blinds, their AC, and be able to call for help when they need it. Whereas if you look at, say, a villa model, we kind of see it as a sort of a bridge between, apartment living and a house. And so that's kind of somewhere in between where they can still have line of sight support while still having some privacy. And we found as well that not all residents want to live alone. Some people actually do want to live with someone else. And so that's where I think the house with 2 resident or 3 resident dwelling type is also quite critical, because it does fit that requirement for people that actually don't want to live by themselves. So I think different models suit different residents.
And how does the apartment model work as far as are you going in there, as you said, when it's being developed, is there a certain number of apartments that can be for specialist disability accommodation within the complex?
Yeah.
And how do you determine, is it a certain number per level? Is it how do you work all of those logistics out?
Yeah, we tend to, there's a density factor that we use when we're deciding how many to put in there. And so it's usually about 10% of the building, which is usually the same amount that a building has to put for adaptable units. So generally, if you're following the BCA guidelines, you have to have a certain number of apartments that are called adaptable. And so what we generally say is, well, let's take those adaptables and turn them into NDIS units. And the idea is that you don't want there to be an over-representation of NDIS participants, because they themselves want to live somewhere where they don't stand out. They want to blend in. They don't want to be seen as the NDIS sort of floor. So we avoid putting them all on one floor. We don't want them to be all in the level 1 where they can't be seen and they can't interact with other people. The idea is that they are scattered through the levels. We tend to keep them on the sort of the bottom half just for logistics. If, there's ever an event of a fire or you've got to get them out or the lift is not working, it's just easier to contain them sort of closer to the ground. But we do try and aim to give them, neighbours that are able-bodied and, and make it feel like they're just part of a community and that, their disability is not, the identifying factor.
Yeah, this is what your inclusion is about.
Exactly,
right? Yeah.
Yes.
And what type of collaboration or engagement do you have with the participants prior to the building? Like how much are participants involved in that process? Yeah.
Again, in the apartment model, in our first few buildings, we really just followed the SDA guidelines, but we soon sort of realised that sometimes following these guidelines didn't necessarily produce these practical spaces or well thought through designs. And so what we did do is actually, we were able to, once participants moved in, we were able to observe how they actually moved through the space, how they used the space, how they opened doors or couldn't open doors. And we quickly realised that, we had made mistakes or, we could learn from the insights that they were giving us and sort of start to put it into the new future projects. And we're lucky to have residents that actually are eager to give us feedback and actually are quite honest with, their suggestions. And so we do keep taking it on board. because we know that it will only improve the designs. And so sort of one example where we did follow the guidelines is we put in one of the kitchens in the first building that we did, we put in 2 adjustable benches, one for the kitchen sink and one for the cooktop. And what we felt is we kind of went over and above on that and by putting 2 adjustable benches, but when it came to practical things like putting cutlery drawers, we had no space to put them. And so, I think just these practical things that we think through now and making sure that, it's accessibility but not at the expense of practical things like having a set of drawers to put, cutlery and so on. So it's a balance. And, just when you think you've bedded down the perfect design formula, you build something that presents other challenges. And so we're continually trying to perfect what we think is a great, aesthetically pleasing, accessible design.
And with the NDIS practice standards, I always tell clients from a compliance perspective that this is just the baseline, that you really need to aim over and above that yes, they're the guidelines, but they're not the rules. You need to, they're not the limit. You actually have to do better than that. Is that the same with the design standards? You see them as the minimum that's required, but, if you can do bigger
yes,
or, more space, you then go and do that for those practical reasons?
Yeah, we call it going above, or best practice in terms of SDA design. So at the back of the guidelines, actually, it says if you do want to do best practice, here are the things that you need or should consider adding. And sometimes it's things like overhead cupboards that pull down automatically. It really is up to the developer to understand how much investment he needs or would like to put into the accommodation. And I always say to the landlords or to the developers, if you are coming into a very cluttered, competitive market, it's those best practice design sort of fixtures and fittings that will make your product or your apartment stand out, and it will allow you to compete with the building that will go up next door eventually with SDA accommodation in there. So, and it's also, making it as easy as possible for someone to operate every single, appliance, cupboard, giving them full access in their own home.
And what do you find to be the most challenging thing about being an SDA provider?
Yeah, I think it's a very, SDA being such a small part of the NDIS budget is quite a confusing, like we've spoken about, very opaque, and it can be really complicated to understand. And so, I even find sometimes that the lack of awareness amongst the industry, but also even when we call NDIS and ask them specific questions about, certain funding things, or, what happens when a participant does X, Y, and Z, what should we do? And there's often not a lot of knowledge. Yeah. So I find that quite difficult to navigate. One of the key challenges for us is the funding gaps that we experience, and we tend to have to cash flow. So from the time that a resident can move into our apartment to the time that their funding gets released, that could be months that we're cash flowing, or even when their plans change or expire. And so that can be really challenging when you're running a small business. Yeah. And now with the the rollout of PACE, I unfortunately think that's probably going to get even more tricky for SDA providers who don't have visibility of a lot of the stuff that we actually had in PRODA. But, the other challenge I find is meeting expectations around, what is an acceptable time to do repairs and maintenance for the residents, because we're dealing mainly with new buildings. We've also got, appliances, air conditioning units that are all under warranty. So when an AC system does go down in 35-degree heat in Penrith, I can't just call out a service technician and say, can you fix this today? Because then I void the warranty that we have for 2 or 3 or 4 years. And so I'm sort of at the mercy then of, the supplier or the manufacturer's time frames. And it's really challenging to balance, the fact that I know that resident needs that AC to be on full blast versus, voiding a warranty that would cost quite a bit of money for the landlord. So it's, things that sometimes are really outside of our control, and you're just trying to balance expectations.
That's an interesting point.
Yeah.
There's been lots of speculation about the SDA changes. There was suggestions in the NDIS review around things like the removal of the IL, improved livability category, and as one of the major changes. But there's also a suggestion of things like a alternative or a new design category. What's kind of your impression of the NDIS review and what might this mean in the future?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely creating a lot of uncertainty for us as providers and for our investors, particularly after it's come off the back of this latest price change where the funding gap between improved livability and high physical support has actually narrowed quite substantially.
Yeah. And
so for investors who saw in July the IL dwelling values almost double in some areas, that actually motivated a lot of discussions with us, with a lot of providers around, well, let's build more IL apartments. It makes sense, right? But then when you consider that from design, if you're developing an apartment, the design through to completion can go from anywhere between, say, 3 to 5 years, you can sort of understand why a developer might not actually want to add in IL in there as a design category to their apartments because, if it is legislated and we do get rid of IL as a category, for them to take those apartments and then retrofit to a HPS or a fully accessible apartment would in often cases be impossible because of the floor space ratio, but also the costs involved in, retrofitting that. So, so as a consequence, I'd say that we're going to see a lot of developers just go back and build high physical support apartments because that's where the funding seems to have stayed fairly stable. And all it's doing is adding to this oversupply of high physical support apartments. And in some areas we have quite a lot of these apartments sitting empty. And I think the uncertainty around all these changes that have been discussed really makes it difficult for this to be considered a solid investment class. I think that it'll play into the hands of these opportunistic developers who kind of skirt around SDA and they proliferate sort of the housing market with things that are not really fit for purpose. So you've got people sort of doing these converted boarding homes, these 10-bedroom boarding homes, because they can. And, it's a, needless to say, it's a space that we're watching pretty closely to see what eventuates.
In regards to the improved livability and the high physical supports, with this oversupply of high physical supports, I think the concern there for me, or that I've noticed, is that is the investor element of that as well. So if we're all building to high physical supports and we're saying to investors, this is the yield you're going to receive or the return you're going to receive based on 3 HPS participants inside your home, they're expecting a very large return for that based on the price guide alone. But they're probably going to get an IL participant in there, and maybe they'll get 2 out of the 3 that they thought they were getting. What then is an investor or even a developer to do knowing that? Should they set their expectations on a lower return, something more realistic, or is it just the idea of no risk, no return? Or how can investors get some kind of certainty?
Yeah, we go through this process very early on when we are talking to a developer or an investor, and we always map out or model 3 scenarios. We do worst case, best case, and the sort of the safe scenario, which is what we say you should base your figures on. This is what you should be letting the banks know that we're going with. And this is the occupancy rate that you need to factor in. These are the vacancy risks, because we always say if we do get what the price guide is telling you that you may get, that would be bonus and that's upside. But we would suggest that you err on sort of the likely scenario for now.
Yeah.
And I think it's just about managing their expectations early on, because what a lot of investors fail to realise is that just because they've built an apartment in Penrith that's 2-bedroom and the price guide says that that's gets whatever, $120,000 a year, they're going to be sitting there waiting for a long time, waiting for a resident who's got that same funding, is going to show up and want to live in that apartment at the time that it's available. Often is the case is that they'll actually have to accept a resident on less funding because they're looking at, okay, well, this apartment's been empty for 6 months. I'm better off getting someone in there rather than leaving it empty. And so they start to work out within their own portfolio how much risk versus, return are they willing to balance or to consider. So it's a tough one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it sounds like that you are managing that uncertainty by really just breaking down all of the different scenarios so that it's all on the table. But I guess with the NDIS and any government scheme, it's not a done thing. It's not like you can build an SDA premises and the government's guaranteeing you anything.
No, exactly.
Not like defence housing. I get that comparison. A lot of people say, well, isn't it like defence housing where they're going to guarantee a person for 3 years? And it's completely different. It's not the model at all.
That's right, yeah. I mean, the only guarantee you have is that your dwelling can be enrolled in the scheme for 20 years. But then the misconception is that when I put a participant in there, that they're going to stay there for 20 years, and that's not the case. They've got the rights, as we all do, to move around after their lease period ends, and they have the freedom to choose where they want to live and, be supported by who they want to choose. And so we do need to educate the developers and the investors to help them understand that, yes, it's a 20-year scheme, but these price guides do change, and they change quite regularly.
Yeah.
And so, before 1st of July came out, we were getting probably up to 20% more for 2-bedroom high physical support accommodation, and the top of that has come off. And so you would hope that the developer had factored in that sort of, buffer. Because really we don't really know where it's going. And it's constantly changing.
As opposed to thinking that 20 years means that you have the participant for 20 years. It's a demand-driven system. So
That's
you
right.
need to make sure that the property's maintained, that it's, aesthetic to begin with, that it's fit for purpose.
That's right.
I've heard a lot about oversupply in SDA generally, but the high physical supports funding obviously kind of perpetuated some of that. Do you think that in the future, if there's too many SDA homes, that these homes will be used for SIL instead?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a consideration. I'd say the oversupply of apartments can definitely be used in different innovative ways. I know that I've considered doing a private rental for some of the empty apartments for people that either don't have SDA funding and want to pay privately, or are building their own SDA and need somewhere in the interim but don't have access to the SDA funds. And so I think as providers, as stakeholders, as investors, we're going to have to look at innovative ways to continue with the yield that they're getting, or to actually to tenant these places. And if it means running them as SIL homes and having an arrangement with the SIL provider to get some sort of reimbursement, I think that's definitely the way it will go.
Because I always like to diversify in businesses, and with SDA specifically, it seems like there's limited ways you could diversify to manage that risk. Moving to SIL might be one of them, or MTA, or STA, something like that. But is there other things that you do to minimise the risk of SDA funding changing dramatically and affecting your business model?
Yeah, we do a lot of, we do ensure that we have the ability to do STA and MTA as well. And so that also helps participants who also want to sort of try before they buy. They might want to try the building. They might want to try the opportunity to live outside of the house, and not have mum and dad around. And so we find that that's a really nice stepping stone. And it also allows us to fill these apartments temporarily up to 90 days whilst we're trying to get, longer term SDA residents.
Yeah.
I don't think we're there yet. I think that there is a lot of demand. I think some of the problem is the sort of the funding that's getting blocked up and not released. And so in the areas that are oversupplied, I think there's definitely ways that we're going to need to start to think, about pivoting to make sure that, we can fill these places. I mean, and even consider things like, affordable housing and community housing.
There's also potentially the changes in the aged care scheme coming out this year that potentially may be a similar model in the aged care space, maybe that might be something for SDA providers to have a look at.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. It's an interesting space to be in. Thank you so much for joining me today to talk all about SDA apartments. It was really wonderful.
Thank you, Tania.
Thanks.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of SDA Mastery by Tania Gomez Consulting. We hope you found this episode helpful and valuable. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, leave us a rating and share it with others. Until next time, keep learning.